Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. Welcome back to the long-awaited and anticipated and much requested return of the car thoughts. Now, for the last 2 years on the Choralosophy Podcast, my daughter Clara has been in the car with me almost all the time because she is a transfer student to my school, which means that I'm her ride. So honestly, I stopped doing car thoughts because I no longer have my car to myself. But I did the other day, and I had some inspiration to make a recording of some thinking out loud, which is what I do usually for 20-25 minutes or so for car thoughts episodes, which I used to do quite a bit before Clara was in high school. But this time it was in reference to some thoughts and some discussions that I'd been having with how music teachers know, and I mean have evidence of whether or not their students are learning. And I'm going to suggest, of course, that engagement doesn't cut it. We can see that students are trying really hard and that they're plugged in and that they're mentally engaged in what we're doing. But what we don't know is what is going in one ear and out the other. Because kids learn at a young age how to show teachers that they are learning, even if they aren't. And with many kids, especially when they're not, they learn to mask that with smiles and bright dispositions and bubbly personalities. And then you test them individually and they have not been learning at all. And this is what we want to try to avoid. So this short episode is designed to get you thinking about your educational practice. And in this episode, I would also submit that as parents, we could be thinking about this more with our kids too. And later you'll hear me mention the example of a shop teacher. Here I'm going to simplify it in the intro for you. A shop teacher is asked, how do you know that your students are learning how to build this desk? Yet, no desk can be viewed that was built by the student. That wouldn't really cut it. And I'm going to suggest that we can't do that in music either. So tune in, have your thinking stimulated and challenged. Then, of course, weigh in on the Choralosophers Facebook group or over on the Substack, choralosophy.substack.com. And don't forget to head to choralosophy.com/shop for your Choralosophy merch, but also the reading rope poster for your classroom and other wall hangings that you can get there with helpful show slogans and all kinds of fun stuff that you can find there at the shop on the website. Are you a director new to the profession? Or are you a seasoned director who is in a new place? One of my favorite tips for generating interest in the program and to instill buy-in is to plan a trip. There are so many options. You can go to Orlando, you can go to Ireland, or you can perform in a parade or a theme park. You can even take the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York. Wherever you end up, not only will your current crew look forward to the trip, but younger students will count the days until it's their turn to go. If you have no idea where to start, connect with Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com. I'm not sure how much, if anything, out there has not gone up in price since 2020, but I know one thing that hasn't, and that is the membership to the Patreon and to the Substack to support this show. The people who are signed up over there as paid subscribers, as my thank you to them, they can get things like t-shirts from the Choralosophy.com shop. They can also get access to my Google folder of teaching materials that I've talked about on the show for over the years. And of course, they just want to help make sure that this show can continue. And one of those benefits is a shout out on the show. The producers and inner circle from Patreon are Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, Jonah Clicksbull, Danelle Eckert, David Kowalczyk, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. So one of my favorite things to think about when it comes to education evidence is the concept related to engagement versus evidence of learning. And I think this is an important one that I think especially in the music world, we get wrong a lot. And so because that's kind of what I do here, I kind of talk about things that I think people miss. Just my opinion, but I'm going to try to make the argument here. So a very common interview question that music teachers might see when they are being hired, and it's actually not just a music teacher question, it's a question that I think a lot of administrators ask every hire that they're doing in their building. How do you know your students are learning? And I hear a lot of responses to this question that are centered on looking for students who appear engaged. Do they appear engaged? Seems to be evidence of learning in music scenarios, and I immediately get pause there because I wonder how that question gets responded to by science teachers, for example, or math teachers, or a shop teacher. How do I know my student is learning math? Well, based on the work they turn in. when they're sitting there by themselves doing the equations, the work that they turn in is my evidence that they understood the concept. That's pretty cut and dry. To be fair to us as music teachers, it isn't quite as cut and dry in what we do, and I'm not trying to make this into apples and apples here. But I do think it's not apples versus, chocolate pudding. We are all fruits here. So I wonder too, in like a build it with your hands shop class, how do I know that my students have learned how to solder a joist? Obviously, I just made all of that up. I don't even know if that's a shop class thing or any of those terms made sense. But the way that I would know that they know it is that I watch them do it. And I didn't do it for them. I stepped aside, they got the materials, and I had the chance to observe them do the thing. And so I'm trying to think of the corollaries here in either of those scenarios, so shop class or science. And if I were to use the, well, they seemed engaged argument as an evidence of learning, and if I were to look at my students in the shop class and say that I know that they know how to solder those joists, because when I was explaining joist soldering, they just looked so into it and so emotionally plugged into that lecture that I just knew that they knew how to do it. I think that we would get laughed out of the room if we were building our classroom that way in that environment. No, you got to watch the kid do it. I don't know that you know how to do it until you do it. And by yourself, without someone else doing it for you or with you. And of course, that depends on the skill, right? So in science, same thing. If I'm talking about chemical equations of some kind, or if I'm thinking about an actual lab experiment where I need to know how to combine certain ingredients safely without an explosion happening, or whatever it is that happens in certain lab classes, the science teacher says, well, I know my students are learning how to do these dangerous chemical combinations because when I'm explaining it and I got to the part about how they might explode, their eyes got really big. I just know they're engaged, which means that they know how to do it. And so I think you can see where I'm going with this here. Engagement in a classroom is extremely important. In fact, for those of you who listen to my grading episodes, I do grade engagement, but I don't grade engagement because it's evidence of learning. I grade engagement because it is a precondition for learning. And that is extremely a different thing. That is a very, very different thing. A kid, and this is just from my experience, it's why the grading system in our class is set up the way it is that kids who are engaged 100% of the time, almost always, literally 99.9% of the time, will learn how to do the stuff I'm teaching them to do. So I grade that rehearsal behavior. I grade that rehearsal habit, not because it's evidence that they've learned how to do music, but because kids who get in the habit of rehearsing in that mentally plugged in, present, eyeballs glistening is the way I like to describe it to kids. And I like here, if you're wondering what I'm looking for your eyeballs to be glistening when we are doing our work and when I'm explaining the work that you're doing. And then when I send you off to do that work, that you're just bubbling with effervescence. That's how I know that you're engaged, but that's not the evidence that you've learned. The evidence that you've learned is when you come back from that, say, student-led sectional, or when you step up to do that sight reading exam by yourself, or when you do your small group part checks that we do. That's the evidence that they've learned how to put the music together. And I think as music teachers, we really do our students a disservice when we don't ask for that evidence. Because what we end up doing, and I don't think we do it on purpose, in fact, I know we don't. I've talked to so many music educators that don't agree with me either explicitly or implicitly here on this type of topic, that of course aren't doing disservices on purpose to their kids when they accept engagement as evidence. Because it looks like the kid is so plugged in, and then when the group starts singing, that plugged in kid still looks like they're emoting and singing and having fun and doing all the things that we do really care about. But then ultimately, we have no evidence that they have learned how to internalize those skills, especially in ensemble music. And this is, again, the challenge. And this has come up on the show a lot. What do I do if I've got a student who they can sing their part when other people are singing it, but not when they're on their own? Do I just give up on that kid? Or do I teach them the skills, the gaps? Do I find the gaps that cause that student to not be able to do those things and then give them tools? Maybe if you're a high school student or a high school teacher like me and you're getting the kid for the first time in 10th or 11th grade and they've got a lot of those gaps, is it realistic that I can fill all that in the time I have them? No, probably not, because these are music language acquisition takes years, just like any other language acquisition, by the way, takes years. And so we can't expect our kids to have all of those gaps filled, but at the same time, I don't think it's fair to them either to just say, well, I'm just going to toss you over in the alto section, have fun. I think there's school, again, and I think we have an obligation to isolate a kid's learning gaps, learning strengths, Give them honest feedback about what those are, and if there are gaps, give them tools to fill them, and those are individual projects. Individual skill building is so important in a music classroom. In ensemble music, I think that gets obscured a little bit because we have this performance goal, and it's group performance typically. But I think that's why it's so important, and in our program, it's set up this way kind of naturally, but it's also intentional over the years that I've crafted these opportunities for kids to sing alone, sing in small groups, be evaluated in small groups, be evaluated alone on a semi-regular basis throughout the school year, even though the choir is still the main goal of the class, but at least we're giving opportunities throughout the year to check in on individual kids' progress. And I think that's really, really important. So if I'm thinking back to kind of how this conversation started, if I'm looking for evidence, I'm actually at the point of the school year. I'm driving right now to graduation. I read the names at graduation. The seniors of the chamber choir sing the national anthem. So that's going to be a joyous occasion. And tomorrow we begin auditioning for next year's advanced group. So we send the seniors off officially, and then the next day we start auditioning. And so I've got data collection on my mind right now because we are essentially seeing how kids are doing through the process of an audition, where we collect data on their music reading, on their vocalization. So are they filling in the gaps of their registration as a singer? Are they figuring out how to negotiate that awkward passaggio? Are they figuring out how to resonate on certain vowel sounds? We're not listening for like advanced vocal solo technique, but just kind of the basic things. Can you contribute in all the areas of your voice in an advanced choir? And then what's your range? Can you prepare a solo on your own? What are your grades? What is your attendance percentage? These are all things that we look for in our top group. And so we're getting ready to collect that data on a new set of kids. And so this is on my mind right now, because now I'm thinking not only are we collecting data on kids through classroom assessments, and those are regular, we're collecting them through small group assessments, again, regularly. And over the course of time, at my Google Drive, this is a part of Patreon people. I can't share this part with you, of course, because it's got student information. Patreon people, of course, I can't share this part with you because it's got student information. But if you were to get a peek into my Google Drive from back to like probably 2012, 13 maybe, you would see mountains of data that I've collected on whether or not the teaching methods that I've been using are working. And of course, anytime you're doing any informal or formal research and education, it's always a little tricky because, of course, every year I've got a different group of kids. But the way that you make any kind of scientific effort to validate your own pedagogy, so to speak, if your sample size gets big enough, then those confounding variables can start to work their way out. In other words, if, yes, you might get a more talented group of kids one year than the next, just kind of naturally more with it and more musically gifted or whatever, and then the next year is a little bit more of a struggle. But if you're looking into like 1,000 plus sample size, that's going to start to even itself out over time. Right? And so that's kind of where I'm sitting right now with my approach to literacy. I'm now about 12 years into keeping data on, using Sight Reading Factory, by the way, on where my kids are in terms of reading fluency by level, by a certain amount, by a certain time. And then in addition to that, it's not just reading, it's also performing music that we've learned and rehearsed in class. I've got evidence for their learning in my Google Drive as well of how their vocal development is happening over the course of time when they test in small groups. In other words, can I hold my own part when there's only one other singer? Can I be heard when there's only one other singer? Can I contribute to the dynamic contrast? Can I make articulated vowel sounds and consonants clearly? Can I coordinate with my ensemble without a conductor? All those types of things we're looking for when we do our small group testing. I've got data there too. And because the rubrics are the same from grade 9 through 12, I can see evidence that they are moving to the right, so to speak, on their rubric. And that shows me that they are getting, on a regular basis, better based on the processes that are happening in the class. And I know, based on individual students, that they're getting better, not just that the choir got a superior rating at whatever festival, or because I heard a recording from one year and I went back and listened, and in my opinion, it was better than it was before, right? These are not evidence that anything is happening in our classroom. And I think it is important to hold ourselves to some kind of a standard when it comes to evidence gathering as educators. And I don't mean because our school district tells us we have to or whatever, but I don't know, some of you might have heard me tell early on in the podcast history the fact that my school district at one point along about that time actually did make me do this. Like, no one had ever taught me that I should be collecting data. The school district started making us collect certain data, and of course, teachers all grumbled and rolled our eyes and stuff, and I did too. I complained as well, and I didn't understand why we were doing it. But then I started getting excited as I started to see the feedback coming in about what I was doing and whether or not it was working, and what types of tweaks could I then make. So one of the tweaks that I made that was probably 7 or 8 years ago, about midway through this process, that I have shared on the show before, is that I went away from grade level standards for reading level, by the way. So I started out that way. When I first started doing individual assessments, I did based on grade level. So all 10th graders will read level X. All 9th graders will start at level Y, and I thought I was doing the right thing. But then I started collecting the evidence, and I started seeing troubling patterns in the actual data that then matched with what I was seeing and hearing from kids. And that to me is like a really compelling set of evidence. So if you're a research nerd, then you would now know that I'm talking about quantitative versus qualitative data. And when those two things match up, you've got something at that point. And what I was hearing was that if the kids were being started at a level that was too low for them, in other words, they were too easy, then they started phoning it in real fast. And then they didn't grow very much from there. So they were doing exercises that were too easy, which meant that they were starting to see reading music as like a joke kind of an activity. Like it wasn't that big of a deal. You don't really have to work that hard at it. On the flip side, I was seeing kids who that same exercise was way too hard, like way, way beyond their capacity. And so what they started to experience was, why would I work hard at this? It's like he's like asking me to lift 1,000 pounds. I can't, no matter how hard I grunt, I'm not going to get it. And so guess what? They didn't work either. And by seeing that data pouring in real time, I made the adjustment to what we do now, which is individual pre-testing when they first come into the program, what level is appropriate for this kid's brain. And I've now developed a really concrete system for this, which is why, even though we are a 2 choir teacher program, I do this part myself because it's kind of a system that I've developed over the years, and it's hard to train somebody on that. But essentially what I can try here with you guys is what I'm listening for is informed a lot by how language, like teachers of early readers are trained to listen for fluency and look for the types of things that cause the kid to stumble, and also whether or not they can recover from the stumble. So a lot of those things inform whether or not I've got them on the right level. So what I do teach 9th graders. They are beginners when it comes to reading by themselves. In our middle school system, they don't really get asked to do that by themselves. So they are coming in cold. And so what I do there is I start them usually with a question. By this point, we're about a month into the school year, and we will have done some sight reading groundwork laying in the classroom already for about a month. And so the first thing I do is I say, when we do this in class as a group, give me a sense of how lost or right with it you feel like we are. And I just ask them that. And based on their response, I decide to start them with either a level of 1, 2, or a 3 on Sight Reading Factory. That's for 9th graders. Now, I might not even dream of level 3 if I'm teaching 6th graders, but I would probably have the same exact approach, which is when we've practiced this in class or in choir rehearsal or whatever, what's going on in your brain? Do you feel like you understand exactly what I'm asking you to do? Do you feel confused all the time? And it goes back to the engagement thing. Or are you just pretending to understand? Now we're one-on-one. You can tell me the truth. And I do get a lot of kids who are very honest. It's like, yeah, I mean, I was always a good singer in elementary school, but when we do this kind of stuff, I have no idea what we're doing. And that's always informative because I look at that kid in rehearsal, they look engaged because they were always reinforced as one of the good choir kids when they were younger. And now they're in high school, we're trying to read music, and then they're like, they have no idea what's going on. And so that's an opportunity for that ice to be broken, where they're able to tell me that evidence of engagement is not evidence of learning. And so I can then set them at that lower level. And again, now I'm giving them a weight they can lift. So I can tell them that you don't know what's going on out there. By doing this by yourself, you're going to have the ability to contribute. And your beautiful voice that your teacher in elementary school heard in you is going to have an opportunity to come out more and more and more in more types of music because you now are going to have this set of tools. And that approach to it works really, really well. And so we have this seeking of evidence that might seem so overwhelming and so nerdy even. Like, why are we robbing getting the joy from a choir class by collecting data and doing science? Well, I mean, number one, I think because kids deserve it. Kids deserve to know how they are doing individually. They deserve to have some kind of a feedback. Even if that destroys a little bit of a bubble that they had when they were younger about how amazing they are, or if, mommy says they're special and now we get to high school and we're behind in a skill, our job as teachers is not to preserve that naivete. Our job as teachers is to give them honest feedback and help them prepare for the world, even if the world they're going into as by their choice does not involve reading music every day. And I think this is one of the things that drives me the most crazy about the discourse on this type of academic rigor that I'm proposing in choir classrooms, is that, well, they're not going to do this. They're not going to read music, even if they were a studio musician, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter what they're going to do when they grow up, in the same way that it doesn't matter that my kid is working really hard right now at home on chemistry, and I promise you that child's not going to be a chemist, but she's working really hard at it right now at home because it's good for her brain to do that calculation in her head. That is, there is just as much benefit, and I would argue in a lot of ways more, and we have evidence of this benefit, of kids learning kinesthetically, orally, and visually all at the same time. Guys, that's music reading. That is the number one way to grow the brain, is to engage all of those, that triangle of senses all at the same time. And yes, that is something that we know. And there isn't a whole lot of ways you can do that outside of teaching them to read music. And it is a brain workout. And of course, yes, it also has artistic value, but at the same time, the brain benefit by itself, in my opinion, is enough to justify it being at school and being an important part of their music experience when they're at school. But then, putting the music reading part aside, many of you have heard my rant on that before, so I don't want to recap everything there. But let's take my small group process. So before every concert, except this last spring, we had so much snow we had to cancel our small group assessment. But we do in-class part checks, and they're for a grade, and we're listening for a specific rubric of the way you sing and the way you collaborate with your group. And of course, in order to do that well, you need to know your part. And so that's their chance to demonstrate that they did that learning in class, that they are working on how that comes out of their mouth hole, so to speak. And there's a technique that we're learning. And are they able to apply that technique? And their grade comes from that, rather than me simply looking around the room and informally verifying that they seem to be with it. Because here's the thing, guys, kids learn, and I used this example before of the kid who was always the best in elementary school, right? They learn to trick us. They learn to show us that they totally get it, so that we won't bother them. And they don't do it on purpose. At least I don't think most of them do. Maybe some of them do. It's not a thing that we do on purpose, or kids do on purpose, but we do learn as young kids how to show the teacher that we understand, even if we don't understand. It's a way to avoid the confrontation, but it's also the way to avoid being embarrassed. So I really want to strongly encourage everyone to not accept engagement evidence as learning evidence, because kids will fall through the cracks when we do that. We will be tricked by them, unintentionally manipulated, whatever it is, and we will see them nodding, for example, when you say a thing, and they're going to nod. Yeah, oh yeah, totally. And then if you ask for evidence of learning in that situation, you might say something like, okay, you understand, that's great, say it back to me in your own words. What did I just tell you? How often that you will do that, you will discover that they had no idea what you were talking about, but they were pretending to. And so this is true with young readers of music, of course, but also young readers of English, by the way. It's a major issue in literacy instruction, is kids will give the impression of reading. They will give the impression that they are reading because they learn the body language of reading. They learn even how to make their eyes look like they are reading. And then when you assess the actual learning later, it turns out they were not reading at all. And because their kids get so good at this, kids move on from first grade to second grade, third grade, they don't even get caught. They get moved on from one grade to another, and then suddenly you assess them a few years later, and it turns out they're still reading at a kindergarten level because nobody sought that evidence, or at least not sufficiently. So these are some of the things that are on my mind right now as we finish up a school year. For me, this will be finishing up year 22. Year 20 is next year for me at Lee Summit High School, where I've been teaching now. Next year will be my 20th year there. And it's an interesting thing for me to reflect on, because I think back to all the earliest years of my teaching career where I was collecting no data on any kid. I had no idea on an individual or small group basis what any of them were understanding or able to do, unless, and with great shame I look back on this, I say unless they were the really talented ones, in which case I did get evidence of their stuff because they're the ones that provided that voluntarily. They're the ones that offered it up by doing a solo at contest, by auditioning for something in college when they were leaving high school. These are the kids that excelled, went on, got scholarships, etc., because they were offering that evidence on their own. So something that I would want us to consider, and this will be kind of how I wrap up this short Car Thoughts episode, is in almost all learning sciences, one of the constants, and this Carol Krieger touched on this with me a little bit in the most recent episode that she was on the show, about a third of the kids in your classroom will learn and do a really good job at whatever you're teaching them, no matter how you teach them. And if we are looking in performing arts programs around the country, I'm afraid what we see is about a third of kids that enter the programs raising to the top of those programs, and then we use that as evidence that we were good teachers. But here's the thing, if you understand the science of learning across all disciplines, about a third of the kids are going to learn to do the thing, no matter what it is, chemistry, math, music, baseball, regardless of who their coach is, regardless of who their teacher is. They're just going to, and what methodology is being used, by the way, they're going to do fine. Another third or so of all of that, of the student population that you see, will struggle unless the pedagogy is really, really good, really solid, effectively delivered, and in line with the way human brains learn. And then there's another third, we'll call it the middle third, that can really go either way. They can respond really, really well and become an excelling student, like really, truly excelling, if they're taught really well. Or they can slip all the way to the bottom and become very frustrated because the pedagogy is ineffective. So the way that we think about these things as music teachers, I think, is unique in the sense that oftentimes we are incentivized so much by that performance goal. And trust me, guys, I've been there too. Like, in fact, I would say I was there 5 years ago. Recently, partly because I do this show now and I talk about the philosophy so much that my philosophies about a lot of this have changed because I've talked to so many people. I've had conversations that really make me think as I present them here to you, but it's really changed my philosophy on how important I think the final performance is. So let me see if I can parse that out. The performance itself is indeed very important. I think it's very important. However, the process is more important. I'm willing to sacrifice some final details to make sure that the process that I'm engaging in with kids is feeding the whole group and the individual all at the same time. Because sometimes we can cut corners by serving just the group and leave individual kids behind, and that's what I'd love for us to avoid. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one. At Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code, and of course now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.